Dear friends, we'll have a short discussion of F.R.Leavis's essay, The English Poetry and the Modern World. It was originally written in French, La Poésie Anglaise. It was translated into English by F.R.Leavis, his wife, from French to English. Lewis himself wrote another book called New Bearings in English Poetry, and thoughts are similar. It appears that the 20 pages length of the essay is made into a full-fledged book. When you read the essay, you find almost it's similar to what T.S. Eliot writes in his essay Tradition, Individual Talent. Here, Lewis discusses the poetry through the ages, and he starts from the Matthew Arnold's concept of poetry, dismissing Dryden and Alexander Pope as the classics of poetry, but of prose. And we must know that Matthew Arnold was a moralist and is a poet of intellect himself. So he considered them as the masters of prose, but not of poetry. And all those who study Arnold's essay, the study of poetry, they know about Arnold's criteria of poetry is high seriousness and emotion. Down the ages, he comes to discuss the romantics like Wordsworth, Keats, by saying that Keats's poetry very simple, sensuous and passionate. That was Milton's formula. And throughout the history of English poetry, you find two streams. One is the poetry of passion, other one is the poetry of intellect, what we call the metaphysical poets. The metaphysical poets are the poets of intellect because they use the conceit. They write poetry by brain, not by mind. On the contrary, we find the poetry of romantics, the poetry of heart. For example, Wordsworth, Coleridge, John Keats. It is passionate, full of emotion and feeling. Then he comes to discuss the poetry of Victorians and telling that Tennyson's poetry is far away from reality. This is a common criticism leveled against the Victorian poets, that Victorian poets were away from the realities of the society. For example, T.S. Eliot, Alfred Tennyson's poem Lotus Eaters. So is the poetry of Robert Browning. But many of us know that Robert Browning's poetry is highly moralistic. So is the poetry of Tennyson. And then he comes to the poetry to discuss the poetry of Arnold as the poetry of pessimism. Arnold vices the pessimism of the age. That is, most of us know. The poet oscillates between the world in which he lives and world is yet to born. So pessimism is represented in Victorian poetry. And F.R.Leavis's objection is that it is away from the social realities. So in a sense, they are escapists from the act of showing their concern to the social problems. And then he comes to discuss the Georgian poetry. And you all know that Thomas Hardy He's the Victorian, but we call him as the last Victorian and the first modern. Hardy's poems as well as novels uh, reveal his pessimism. He also refers to the poetry of Alfred Noyes as a modern poet, Georgian poet. He comes to discuss Georgian poetry, but he says some two or three sentences of the Georgian poetry and suddenly jumps into the modern poetry of T.S. Eliot. And straightway he comes to the discussion of Wasteland. Wasteland is a masterpiece of 20th century modern poetry because he represents the post-war British society, the effects of war on the British society, how the relationship between sexes was spoiled. The same thing is delineated elaborately by T.H. Lawrence in most of his novels. The failure of sexual relationship between men and women, which leads to infertility and sexual deviations. Lawrence writes in Women in Love. It's almost a thesis novel. Women in Love is a thesis novel in which he says about the sexual deviations, how there is a moral degradation in a modern society, how the men and women become imbecile, insipid and shallow. That is all post-war. So T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, he calls it a wasteland in the sense the land becomes waste. He symbolizes the infertility. That is, he says there is no water but only the sound of water. But the sound of water is heard at the end, da datta dayad fam. So Eliot's, F.R.Leavis's saying is that poetry of Eliot, that is in the wasteland, expresses the issues of the modern world. It shows the concerns of the modern world. Obliquely, you can see it expresses the social problems. So there is an expression of modern life in the wasteland. The whole wasteland is described as a heap of broken images. He himself, he says the words. So that, of course, that is a technically it is a par excellence, and there is no narrative, no dramatic cohesion. Many personages appear, all distanced from one place to the other place. The characters come and go. So there is also a character of Thers, the one-eyed, that's a hermaphrodite character is there, a man-woman character. So he expresses, even he tells about the moral degradation, sexual infertility, frustration, alienation, all the modern world. So that's what F.R.Leavis says, the English poet in the essay, the English poetry and the modern world. So only in the poetry of T.S. Eliot we find the expression of the life of the modern world in his poem. That is a masterpiece. You can say, we also say it calls the modern epic, The Wasteland. Thank you.